Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. Chapter 15, in which the bag with the banknotes is relieved of a few £1,000 more. The train had stopped at the station. Passepartout first got out of the car, and was followed by Mr. Fogg, who aided his young companion to descend. Phileas Fogg counted on going directly to Hong Kong steamer, in order to fix Mrs. Aouda there comfortably, which he did not wish to leave as long as she was in this country, so dangerous for her. At the moment that Mr. Fogg was going out of the station, a policeman approached him and said, Mr. Phileas Fogg, I am he. Is this man your servant? added the policeman, pointing to Passepartout. Yes. You will both be so kind as to follow me. Mr. Fogg made no movement to indicate any surprise. This agent was a representative of the law. For every Englishman the law is sacred. Passepartout, with his French habits, wanted to discuss this matter, but the policeman touched him with his stick, and Phileas Fogg made him a sign to obey. "This young lady can accompany us?" asked Mr. Fogg. "She can," replied the policeman. The policeman conducted Mr. Fogg, Mrs. Aouda, and Passepartout to a palkiari, a sort of four-wheeled vehicle with four seats, drawn by two horses. They startled. No one spoke during the 20-minute ride. The vehicle first crossed a black town, with narrow streets, huts with grovelled miscellaneous population, dirty and ragged. They passed through the European town, adorned with brick houses shaded by coconut trees, bristling with mats, through which, notwithstanding the early hour, were driving handsomely dressed men in Eglin turnouts. The Pacalari stopped for a dwelling plain appearance, but it was not used for private purposes. The policeman led his prisoners out, for they could, indeed, be called thus, and led into a room with grated windows, and saying to them, "At 8:30 you will appear before Judge Obaya." Then he left, and dosed the door. "See, we are prisoners," cried Passepartout, dropping with a chair. Mrs. Aouda, addressing Mr. Fogg immediately, said in a voice whose emotion sought in vain to disguise, "Sir, you must leave me. It is on my account that you are pursued. It is because you that rescue me." Phileas Fogg contented himself that would not be possible. On pursuit on this account of this sooty affair, inadmissible. How would the complaints dare present themselves? It was a mistake. Phileas Fogg added that, in any event, he would not abandon the young woman, and he would take her to Hong Kong. "But the steamer leaves at noon," remarked Passepartout. "Before noon we will be on board," was the simple reply of the impassible gentleman. That is so flatly asserted that Passepartout could not help but saying to himself, "Parbleu, that is certain. Before noon we will be on board." But not all was reassured. At 8:30 the door of the room was opened. The policeman reappeared, and he led the prisoners into the next room. In the court-room, a quite large crowd, composed of European natives, were occupied at the rear of the room. Mr. Fogg, Miss Aouda, and Passepartout were seated on a bench in front of the seats reserved for the magistrate and the clerk. This magistrate, Judge Obida, entered almost immediately, followed by his clerk, who was a large fat man, and took a wig hung on the nail and hastily put it on his head. "First case," he said. He putting on his head to his head and said, "Humph! This was not my wig." "That is a fact, Mr. Obida. It is mine." "My dear Mr. Oysterpuff, how do you think that a judge can give a wise sentence to a clerk's wig?" An exchange of wigs had been made. In these preliminaries Passepartout was boiling out of impatience, for the hands appeared to him and moved terribly fast in the pace of a large clock in the court-room. "First case," said Judge Obadiah. Again, "Phileas Fogg," said Clerk Oysterpuff. "Here I am," replied Mr. Fogg. "Passepartout?" "Present," said Passepartout. "Good," said Judge Obadiah. "For 2 days you have been looked for 2 days, prisoners, you have been looked for upon your arrival of all trains at Bombay. But whatever you accused?" cried Passepartout impatiently. "You shall know," replied the judge. "Sir," said Fogg, "I am an English citizen. I have the right—" "Have you been treated disrespectfully?" replied Mr. Obadiah. "Not at all. Very well. Let the complaints come in." Upon the order of the judge a door was opened, and 3 Hindu priests were led by a tipstaff. "Well, well," replied murmuring Passepartout, "there are rascals who are going to burn our little lady." The stood up before the judge, and the clerk heard in a loud voice the complaints of the sacrilege, and preferred against Mr. Fogg and his servant, accused of having violated the plaintiffs consented by the Brahmin religion. You have heard the charge? Said the judge asked Phileas Fogg. Yes, sir, replied Mr. Fogg, consulting his watch, and I confess it. Ah, you confess? I confess and expect that three peace were going to confess in their turn what we're going to do at the pagoda of the Pilari. The priests looked at each other. They did not seem to understand the words of the accused. Truly, cried Passepartout, at the pagoda of Pilari they were going to burn their victim. More stupefaction of the priests, and the profound astonishment of the Judge Obadiah. What victim? He said. Burn whom? In the city of Bombay? Bombay? Cried Passepartout. Certainly, we are not speaking of the pagoda at Pilai, but the pagoda of Malabar in Bombay. And that is proof of this desecrated shoes, said the clerk, putting up a pair of my shoes, cried Passepartout, who, surprised at the last charge, did not prevent this involuntary exclamation. The confusion in their minds of the master and servant may be imagined, but they forgot the incident of the quota at Bombay. This was the very thing that had brought them before the magistrate in Calcutta. In fact, Phipps understood the advantage that he might get from this unfortunate affair. Delaying his departure 12 hours, he had taken the counsel with the priests of Malabar had promised them large damages, knowing very well that the British government was very severe on this kind of trespass, and the following train he had sent them forward on the track of their perpetrator. In the consequence of this time employed in deliverance of this young widow, Fix and the Hindus arrived at Calcutta before Phileas Fogg and his servant, whom the authorities warned by telegraph were to arrest as they got off a train. And the disappointment of Fix may be judged of when he learned that Phileas Fogg had not yet arrived in the capital of India. He was compelled to think that his robber, stopping once at one of the stations of the Peninsular Railway, might have taken refuge in the northern provinces. For 24 hours, in the greatest uneasiness, Fix watched him at the station, for what though one this very morning saw him get out of the car accompanied, it is true, by a young woman whose presence he could not explain, he immediately sent out policemen after him. This is how Mr. Fogg, Passepartout, and the widow of Rajah of Bundlecombe were taken before the Judge Obadiah. And if Passepartout had been less occupied with his affair, he would not have been perceived a corner of the room in the detective, who followed the discussion with an interest uneasy with an interest easy to understand, for Calcutta as at Bombay and at Suez, the warrant of arrest was still not at hand. The Judge Obadiah had taken note of the confession. Escape from Passepartout would have given all he possessed to recall his imprudent words. And the facts are admitted, said the judge. Admitted, replied Fogg coldly. As inasmuch, continued the judge, as an English law intends to protect equally and rigorously all religions of the people of India, the trespass being admitted by this man, Passepartout, has convicted of violated with sacrilegious feat of pavement of the pagoda of Malabar Hill in Bombay on the 20th day of October. I sentence the said Passepartout to 15 days of imprisonment and a fine of £300. £300? Cried Passepartout, who was really only laughed at the fine. Silence! Said the tipstaff in a shrill voice. And, added Judge Obadiah, inasmuch as the not repeatedly reproved, there was not a connivance between the servant and the master, the latter whom ought to be held responsible for the acts and gestures of the servant in his employ. I detain the said Phileas Fogg and sentence him to 8 days imprisonment and £150 fine. Clerk, call another case. Fix, in this corner, experienced an unspeakable satisfaction. Phileas Fogg detained 8 days in Calcutta. It would be more than enough time for the warrant to arrive. Passepartout was crushed. This sentence was ruin his master. Wager of £25,000 was lost, and all because, in the height of this folly, he had gone into that cursed pagoda. Phileas Fogg, as much as his master himself, as if this sentence did not concern him. He did not even knit his eyebrows, but at the moment that the clerk was calling another case, he rose and said, I offer a bail. It is your right, replied the judge. Fix felt a cold shudder down his back, but he recovered himself again. And when he heard the judge, in consideration that the fact of Phileas Fogg and his servant both being strangers, fixed a bail for each enormous sum of £1,000. It would cost Mr. Fogg £2,000, unless he would be cleared for his sentence. I will pay for it, said that gentleman, and which he took her bag which Passepartout carried, and some bundle of banknotes, in which he placed on the clerk's desk. This sum will be returned to you on the coming out of prison. In the meantime, you are free under bail. Come, said Phileas Fogg under, to his servant. But they should at least return me my shoes, replied Passepartout, in an angry movement. They returned him his shoes. These are dear, more than £1,000 apiece, without counting that they pinch me. Passepartout, with a very pitiful look, followed Mr. Fogg, who had offered his arm to the young woman. Fix still hoped that his robber would not decide to surrender the sum of £2,000, that he would serve out his day's imprisonment. He put himself, then, on Fogg's track. Mr. Fogg had took a carriage in which Mr. Ouda, Passepartout, and he got in immediately. Fix ran behind the carriage and soon stopped in one of the wharves of the city. Half a mile out of the harbour of Rangoon was anchored the sailing flag hoisted on the top of the mast. 11 o'clock struck, and Mr. Fogg was 1 hour ahead. Fix saw him get out of the carriage and embark on a boat with Mrs. Ouda and his servant. The detective stamped his foot. "The rascal!" he cried. "He's going off. £2,000 sacrificed. Prodigal as a robber. I will follow him to the end of the world, if that is necessary. But at the rate at which he is going, all the stolen money will be gone." The detective had good reason in making this remark, in fact, since he left London, with what travelling expenses, rewards, and elephant purchase, bail, fines, Phileas Fogg had already scattered more than £5,000 on his route, and the percentage of the sum recovered, promised to detectives, was constantly diminishing.